My name is Ankur. I am a PhD student in the Ties department, and today I'll be presenting my job market research, which is on experimentation and uses the television industry in the United States as its empirical setting. Now, the motivation for my research comes from my time in industry. When I was at Microsoft, oftentimes employees would come up with ideas for new inventions, new products, and rather than take those ideas, those nascent ideas, and take them and fund them all the way to market, it was very natural for executives to decide to fund them for a shorter period of time, to learn more about those ideas, to experiment on those types of ideas before funding them all the way to market. Now, what these experimental teams learned was there was this unintended consequence to this type of experimentation, that employees at Microsoft didn't want to join these teams, that employees at Microsoft preferred organizations like Office or Windows that could provide a career for these employees, as opposed to an experimental team that might get shut down in a few months, leaving those employees scrambling to find new work. So the decision to experiment on an idea rather than commit to it for a long period of time had this downside that potentially lowered the potential of those ideas because you weren't able to attract the talent necessary for those ideas to really flourish. This leads me to my research question, which is, when does this type of experimentation in the form of stage development, where you learn more about an idea over time, actually improve your final outcomes? I don't think this is a trivial question because there's a real tension here. On the one hand, there's a very natural instinct about this type of experimentation improving ideas, because early on in the process you can shut those ideas down if you learn they have a potential to be failures, and you don't have to spend the money taking those ideas all the way to market. You might also learn through this stage process. You might get customer feedback from early adopters, or within your organization from executives that helps improve ideas in this type of process. So those things can make those ideas better and your outcomes better through experimentation. On the other hand, we talked about the drawbacks to experimentation already. One of them, which is it might be harder for you to attract labor. If workers in your industry prefer long-term contracts, especially in these kind of innovative industries where human capital is really important, that could be very harmful to your outcomes. Of course, the strategy literature also talks about commitment as being very important. Signaling that you are in an industry or in a business for a longer term can deter entrants from entering your industry. And that's something that if you don't commit to, if you have experimental processes, perhaps you're inducing entry, which reduces your final outcomes. And then lastly, incentives might change. Your workers could start thinking about, how do I get my next round of funding for this project? And what are the actions I can do in the short run to improve the signal from the experiment, which could be orthogonal to what's really necessary for long-term success. Perhaps you go after easier to attract but lower value customers when you experiment versus when you're thinking longer term. Now, I study this tension between the benefits and drawback to experimentation in television. And in television, the products I'll be looking at are going to be television shows. They start out as scripts and are written ideas for a potential product, and they turn, of course, into the television shows that you watch on television or streaming services today. Now, what's interesting about this production process is that it's very standardized in the industry. It takes a year, and multiple firms in the industry use a very similar process. Now, within this process, there's often an intermediate stage called a pilot, which is basically the first episode of a television show. And the pilot gives more information about the potential of a show than just the script itself. It's a form of stage development where you have the script, you decide to fund it for the pilot phase, and then based on what you learn from the pilot phase, you continue the process all the way to market. And my empirical approach is really going to be looking at two shows that are otherwise similar to each other in the script phase, one that had piloting as an intermediate stage and one that didn't, and then look at how the outcomes differ by this variation in piloting. In effect, I'm looking for a treatment effect of piloting as a way to get at this question of, does experimentation improve final outcomes or not? Now, I use two different institutional details in my analysis. One is that piloting was the predominant form of production. So this is a chart that shows what's the percentage of shows historically that have been non-piloted. In industry jargon, that's called straight-to-series production. And I'm plotting here the incumbent networks in this television industry. So think of your ABCs, your HBOs, the people that have been doing television for a long time. And you see, prior to 2014, something like 97% of all shows were piloted. 3% of shows went straight to series. This changed in 2014. Now there's some variation. Now we see that 10 to 15% of all shows go straight to series. And when I spoke to folks in the industry about what caused this shift in production within the incumbent networks, one thing came up and again, which was Netflix's influence. So in 2013, Netflix had success of 2 shows which actually used a non-piloted process. They took their scripts directly to the full show production and skipped the pilot phase. And this was a novel thing for the industry overall. And it caused a lot of uncertainty on the part of the incumbents. Some industry executives thought that this new production process was really critical to Netflix's success and latched onto it. They thought that experimentation, this through piloting, was detrimental in that it didn't let the creators of shows really think about their ideas and flesh out their ideas before executing on them. And so they viewed this lack of piloting, this straight to series production, as something that they wanted to go and replicate. While other network executives kind of view this as a fad. Their position was that piloting is something that's been ingrained in this industry since the 1950s, and there's no reason to change. Netflix just got lucky. It's nothing to do with their different production process. And so my main kind of matching estimator that I use in my paper is focused on this set of shows in this post period that perhaps could have gone either way depending on what the network executives at the time were thinking about this new uncertainty around production processes. I'm looking for shows that, maybe it's a cop drama that if it was on CBS, it would have been piloted, and then on NBC, it would have been non-piloted, depending on the beliefs of the heterogeneity in the beliefs of the network executives. The second, and so when I look at just the effect of piloting based on that analysis, I find that piloting has a negative effect. That within this match set of shows where there's this uncertainty caused by Netflix, that piloting is detrimental to outcomes. And this is about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So it's taking a show and making it slightly worse when you pilot a show. The second institutional fact I use is that the creators of a show actually matter. In much the same way in entrepreneurship, the founders of a startup are very important to the success of the startup. And when these creators for shows have a long history of success, when they've won awards in the past, they're very different in terms of how useful piloting is. So here I'm charting for creators that have won a prestigious award in the past versus creators that have not won an award in the past. What is the propensity of passing this pilot phase? And you see that for creators with these types of awards, there's a much higher propensity of passing the pilot phase. And I'm interpreting that as saying, this piloting with these creators with awards is much less effective at providing information about the final outcomes. It's less useful in filtering out bad ideas when I know that the creator has a track record of success in the past. And so I'm going to looking for heterogeneity in the treatment effect of piloting depending on the background of the creators. And that's what I do see. I see that when you pilot a show with creators that have no background, that don't have a track record of success, that's when piloting actually seems to improve outcomes, that you're better off by piloting with these shows. Meanwhile, if you know someone is already good and has a track record of success, that's when piloting can be detrimental. And that's my main kind of result in my paper is this experimentational process is very heterogeneous, and the value, the treatment effect of experimentation varies with the amount of attrition that experimentation can produce. When it's shutting down lots of bad ideas, that's when experimentation is useful. But if you're going through stage development and you're not shutting down ideas through that, then perhaps stage development is not the way you should go and innovate. Now, my paper continues with a conversation about whether or not this is just a selection bias in terms of certain shows being picked for piloting versus not piloting. And I show some evidence that my main result is not due to selection bias. And I also talk about some evidence about what the mechanism might be. I find evidence that these shows that are piloted have a harder time attracting high-quality actors, which talks to that long-term labor preference, long-term contract preference on the part of labor, as well as an incentive change. It seems that creators focus on making the pilot better to the detriment of the series when you pilot, making the first episode better to the detriment of the series, because they want their shows to get past the pilot phase. So they might put more car crashes or plot twists in the pilot, which then do not set up the rest of the season in the proper way, and that lowers the quality of the television show overall. Now, I think this research is important because experimentation is something that we're looking to do more and more often within industries. So as services like Amazon Web Services reduce the cost for someone to spin up a new idea and execute on it, the general idea might be that one approach to this experimentation would be like, as the cost of experimentation goes to zero, we should just keep doing more and more more and more experimentation, because experimentation helps weed out bad ideas. And I think I'm trying to argue that this corner solution may not be the right one for organizations, that we have to think about the downsides to experimentation when we decide to experiment on ideas. So in my specific example, what one team at Microsoft did was they decided to bet on people as opposed to the idea. So Office Labs was within Office, and to get around this problem of recruiting talent within Microsoft, they offered to continue employment for people when a project was shut down within Office Labs, so that people were certain about having a career within Office Labs and they wouldn't lose their jobs right away. And that might not work for all industries because there's less skin in the game, for example, but this is the type of thinking that we need to encourage when we talk about experimentation. Thank you for your time.